The Sibren had never been alone, and did not have a word for it, because you do not have a word for a thing that has never happened to anyone you are. I am going to call it Lo, because that is what the humans at the relay station called it, after the note the station's old air handler made in the deep watches, a sound you felt in the floor more than heard, and because the Sibren's own name for itself was not a name at all but a place in the great shared sense of its kind, a position in a mind 400 billion strong that reached, without regard for distance, across the whole settled dark. Under the seam, where the Sibren keep the nerve that makes them one, there is no far. Every mind is adjacent to every other. To be a Sibren is to be a note in a chord that has been sounding, unbroken, for longer than the accord has kept records, and Lo had been that note its whole existence, and had never once, not for an instant, been by itself. It had come to the human relay station on a routine audit, one note of the swarm sent to sense a place the accord wished sensed, because that was the Sibren's use to the galaxy. They felt a room before it spoke, read a world's mood off its surface, and reported. Lo had audited 100 stations. You arrived, you opened the sense, you felt the shape of the minds in the place, and you knew them, not their words, but their weather, the grief and boredom and hope of them, as plainly as you knew your own, because to a Sibren another mind is not a locked room. It is simply more of the chord. So Lo arrived at the station, and opened the sense, and reached for the one human keeping the watch there, a technician the roster called June Alder, the way it had reached for every mind it had ever neared. And it touched nothing. Not emptiness. That was the thing Lo would spend the rest of its existence trying to make the swarm understand, and fail, because the swarm had no place to put it. June Alder was not empty. Lo could see that she was full of a whole weather of a mind, grief and wit and a tiredness and a quick bright warmth, all of it plainly there behind her eyes. But it was behind a shore Lo could not reach. Lo reached, the way you reach for a hand in the dark, and the hand was there, Lo could see it was there, and there was no way across to it. For the first time in a life measured in the shared sense of 400 billion, Lo reached for a mind and the mind did not reach back, because it could not, because it had no channel to reach with, because it was an island, entire of itself, in a way no Sibren had ever been or could ever be. This is the story of the loneliest thing that ever happened to the most connected mind in the galaxy, and of the human who taught it, patiently, across a gap that never once closed, how to be a friend to someone you cannot feel. It is the gentlest story I have to tell you, and it is also, underneath, the most frightening, because Lo learned at that relay station the thing the whole accord was built on not knowing, and learned it not as a number but as an ache, that there are minds you cannot pool, and cannot break together, and cannot reach, and that the galaxy was full of them, 4,000 million of them, each one alone in a way the Sibren had never had to bear even once. Lo took the reading again. That was the first thing it did, and the second, and for the whole of the first day it did almost nothing else, because a Sibren faced with a sense that does not resolve does the only thing its nature allows, which is to sense harder. The housing the swarm had given this rotations node was a modest thing, built for auditing rather than show, a matte gray sphere about the size of a human head, set into a bracket in the station's single corridor where the air recyclers hummed all watch and the traffic of the station's one occupant passed it a dozen times between meals. It had no face, because a Sibren node has no need of one, the sense doing the work a face would otherwise do, reading a room's mood before the room has finished deciding what expression to wear. So for the first hours of the audit Lo did what it always did in an unfamiliar corridor, which was nothing visible at all, a still gray shape logging a weather it did not need eyes to log. It was only when the weather would not come that Lo, for the first time in its existence, began to move. To understand what the reading actually was, and why its failure struck so deep, you have to understand what a Sibren is under the sense, and it is not what the old human stories mean when they say a mind reached into another mind through the empty air. It is anatomy, not magic. Beneath the seam that runs the length of every Sibren body there is a single nerve, one nerve, that every Sibren is born fused to and never afterward parted from, the way a hand is never afterward parted from its arm, and that nerve does not end at the skin the way a human nerve ends at a fingertip. It threads on past the visible edge of the body the way a root threads on past the visible edge of a tree, unseen but continuous, until it meets the corresponding thread reaching out from the nearest other Sibren, and the two lengths become, for every practical purpose of feeling, one nerve instead of two. Multiply that meeting by 400 billion instances, across every Sibren the swarm has ever grown, and you have the cord, not a mystical union, not a shared soul, a single continuous organ of feeling grown between 400 billion bodies, very likely the largest anatomical structure in the settled dark, and every living Sibren is simply a place where that organ happens also to keep a body. Distance, to a nerve like that, is not the thing it is to an eye or an ear. The nerve does not weaken across the miles the way a voice weakens across the miles. Nearness and farness are properties of the surface the nerve runs along, and the surface, under the seam, has no far corners at all. Every mind wired into it sits adjacent to every other, the way 2 points on the rim of a wheel are no distance apart along the rim, however many empty miles of spoke and air might separate them if you insisted on measuring the wrong way. The swarm sense returns a nearness for every mind. It is not a distance in the surface way, under the seam there is no distance, it is a nearness of feeling, a measure of how open a mind lies to the shared sense, and every mind Lo had ever met returned a nearness, from the wide bright nearness of its own kind to the guarded, narrow, but always present nearness of the other catalogued species, the Velthani with their cool deliberate weather, the Orisk with their banked heat, the Kedmer with their gossiping warmth. Every mind lay open, to a Sibren, by some amount. That was the law under all the Sibren's laws. Minds are near. The sense reaches them. There is no mind the sense does not reach. June Alder's nearness returned nothing Lo could read. Not zero, zero would have meant a wall, a mind closed against it, and Lo knew closed minds, they had a shape. This was not closed. This was a reading that simply did not resolve, a reaching that went out and found the mind unmistakably present and unmistakably unreachable, an island with a shore Lo could see and no water it could cross. Lo took the reading, and took it again, and again, all through the first day, the way you press a sore tooth, unable to leave alone the one place in the whole sensed universe that would not answer. The human noticed. That was the second impossible thing, and Lo did not understand it for a long time. Lo had audited 100 stations and been, to the minds in them, mostly a presence they half felt and did not remark on, unremarked upon the way weather is unremarked upon. But June Alder, whom Lo could not feel at all, felt Lo. Not with any sense, she had no sense, that was the whole trouble, but with the ordinary human attention that Lo would come to understand was the human's whole substitute for the thing they did not have. She watched the Sibren node in its housing, the way it oriented and reoriented toward her, and on the evening of the first day she put down her tools and looked directly at it and said, in the plain flat voice of a person who has decided to stop pretending not to notice something. You keep reaching for me. I can't feel it, whatever it is, but I can see you doing it. And you keep stopping. Like it's not working. Is it not working? Lo had no way to answer her. That was the third thing. Lo was built to be understood without answering, to share rather than say, and June was the one mind in the galaxy it could not share with, which meant that for the first time in its existence Lo had to find another way to be known, had to learn, from nothing, the thing every human is born having to do and never stops doing, reach a mind you cannot enter, using only the poor slow tools of the outside, a gesture, a light, a word. Lo turned its housing toward her, once, deliberately, and then away, and then back, the only thing it could think to do, a movement, a reaching made visible because it could not be made felt. And June Alder, watching, understood it, the way humans somehow always understand each other across the unbridgeable gap they all live in, and she said, softly, "Oh. You can see me and you can't reach me." And she stopped, because she had grasped something, and it had cost her a little to grasp it. "That must be strange for you. You're used to reaching, aren't you? You're used to everyone being right there." She was quiet a moment. "Welcome to how the rest of us live, friend. Every day of our lives. Nobody's ever right there. We just get good at shouting across." The relay station did not sit on anything, in the way planets sit on nothing and call it orbit. It was bolted, instead, to a nickel iron rock a few hundred meters across, an anchor point at the dead center of the long empty stretch between two settled systems, chosen 100 years before Lo arrived because a signal passing through that exact point in the dark lost less of itself than a signal passing through any other point nearby, and someone with a chart and a slide rule had decided that a few hundred meters of rock and a pressurized shell were a fair price for the difference. It was not a place, in the sense most people mean when they use that word. It was a fact about geometry that a person happened to live inside. June Alder lived inside it. She was the whole crew, had been for the better part of 2 years before the swarm ever sent a node to audit her, and she ran the station as though it were a small house she had stopped expecting anyone to visit, competently, out of habit, with small rituals that existed for no one but her and that she kept anyway, because a life needs its rituals whether or not anyone is watching them happen. She woke at the same hour the recyclers changed cycle, because the change in the hum woke her whether she wanted it to or not. She ran the relay's diagnostics before breakfast, out of an old discipline nobody would have punished her for dropping. She kept, in the station's one warm room, a shelf of hydroponic trays where she grew a stubborn strain of station-bred greens under a misting cycle she had rigged herself, and she called the mist, the weather, and reported it to no one in particular each morning the way a person on a homeworld might glance out a window and remark on the sky, because a life that has no sky will grow one out of whatever it has, given enough time and enough loneliness to make the growing worth the trouble. She had asked for the posting. That was the part Lo understood last, because it seemed, on its face, to make no sense, this small quick warm-weathered mind choosing, of her own will, 2 years alone on a rock in the dead center of nowhere. But June had told it herself, in the plain unadorned way she told Lo everything, that she had asked for it precisely because she was tired of people, tired in the specific worn-down way of someone who has spent too many years being reached for by hands that wanted something from her and not enough years being reached for by hands that just wanted her, and she had thought, when she filed the request, that the cure for being tired of people was simply fewer of them. She had been wrong, she told Lo, cheerfully, without any bitterness Lo could have read even if it had a way to read her. She had gotten out here and found that what she had actually been tired of was being reached for badly, not being reached for at all, and that the second kind of tired was so much worse than the first that she had spent her 2 years teaching herself to reach across the dark to the one person she still had, her sister, 3 systems away, in letters that took the better part of a season to arrive and be answered, because if you cannot be near anyone you had better get very good at being far from them. Well, Lo logged all of this, in the first days, the way it logged everything, as data about the mind in the station, without understanding yet that it was not data about a mind. It was the mind. Whereas Sibren would have simply felt June's loneliness and her cure for it in one continuous unbroken sense, a single unmistakable weather, Lo had to gather her the slow way, in pieces, across days, out of things she said and things she did and the small rituals she kept for no witness but herself, and it would be a long while yet before Lo understood that this piecing together was not a lesser, poorer version of sensing a mind. It was the only version there had ever been, for 4,000 million minds that had never had any other, and it took an amount of patience and attention that made the swarm's effortless, total feeling look, for the first time in Lo's long existence, almost like a kind of laziness. It took Lo a long time to believe that June was not in pain. This was the thing its whole nature fought. Lo reached for June and found her separate, island, unreachable, and every instinct of a mind that had never been alone read that separateness as a wound, as a person cut off, isolated, grieving in a solitude too terrible to sense. Lo pitied her, at first, with the enormous helpless pity of a creature that cannot imagine the thing it is pitying. It thought June Alder must be the loneliest being in the galaxy, marooned inside herself, and it grieved for her the way it would have grieved for a note struck from the chord. And June was not marooned, and was not, most of the time, lonely, and lived her separate island life with a matter-of-factness that slowly took Lo's pity apart. She talked to it. That was how Lo learned her, in the end, not by sensing her, which it could never do, but the way humans learn each other, by listening. June narrated her days to the Sibran in its housing, at first because she was lonely on the posting and it was company of a kind, and later because she had understood what Lo was and had decided, with the stubborn generosity Lo would come to think of as the most human thing about her, to teach the unreachable creature what it was missing by simply telling it. She told it about the weather on the station, which did not change and which she reported anyway. She told it about the tea, which was bad, and which she made twice a day and complained about both times. She told it about her sister, 3 systems away, whom she wrote to and missed. She told it about the small doings of a small life, plainly, one thing at a time, and Lo began to understand that this poor slow telling, this shouting across the gap, was not a lesser thing the humans did because they lacked the sense. It was a whole art, ancient and enormous, the art of being known by someone who cannot feel you, and the humans had been practicing it since before they had left their death world, because they had never had anything else, because every one of them had always been an island, and they had built, out of nothing but words and patience and attention, a way to reach across the water that no Sibran had ever needed and no Sibran could quite believe. There were specific days Lo came to know the shape of, the way a person coming to know a friend learns not just their moods but their calendar. There was the day the supply drone came, once every so many weeks, and June met it at the lock with the particular brightness of someone starved for a face even though the drone had none, and unpacked its crates slowly, on purpose, to make the smallness of the event last longer than it wanted to. There was the day, later in every cycle, when a return message from her sister arrived on the relay's own traffic, which June found funny in a way she explained to Lo more than once, that she spent her working hours passing other people's words across the dark faster than light strictly ought to allow and then waited, like anyone else, the ordinary aching while for her own. She did not read the letters aloud to Lo, not at first, because some things a person keeps even from a friend who cannot repeat them to anyone, but she told Lo what was in them, in her own words, in the manner of someone describing a letter rather than handing it over, that her sister had planted something new in the garden and it had died and she was trying again, that her sister's knee was bad in the cold months and good in the warm ones, that her sister missed her plainly, in every letter. In a way June answered plainly in return, because 2 people who love each other across 3 systems of empty dark cannot afford to be subtle about it. There is no time in a life measured in seasons per letter for anything but saying the true thing outright. The tea itself deserved its own accounting, June said, more than once, because it was the one part of the posting that had never improved. The station stores ran to a compressed brick of leaves grown on some overprocessed hydrofarms several transfers back down the supply chain, and no matter how she measured it, or how long she let it steep, or what she muttered at the kettle while she waited, it came out the same faintly metallic gray-brown that she swore, laughing, tasted like the inside of the recycler intake. She made it twice a day anyway, morning and evening, because a ritual does not require that the thing at its center be good, only that it be reliably there, and she held the cup with both hands even when the station ran at a comfortable temperature, because the warmth of it in her palms was, she told Lo, its own kind of company, a small ordinary comfort that did not care whether anyone was watching her take it. Lo logged the tea for a long time as simply more data, the bad tea, the twice daily complaint, before it understood that the tea was never really the point. The point was the twice-a-day proof that June kept showing up for her own small life even when there was no one to keep it for but her, which turned out, in the end, to be the plainest lesson in the whole rotation about what a person is. She taught Lo words, too, without meaning to teach anything at all. She would say a thing was fine, in a voice that plainly meant it was not fine, and then, catching Lo's housing turned toward her in its small confused way, she would laugh and say, "Sorry, that one's a human trick, we say fine to mean 5 different things and expect you to guess which," and then she would tell it which, so that slowly, across the first weeks, Lo began to build something it had never in its existence needed before, a private lexicon, a set of human sounds and the actual feelings they stood in for, assembled one correction at a time, the way every human child on every human world has always had to assemble the very same thing, from nothing, in the dark, by trial and by being gently, patiently corrected. "You feel everyone," June said to it one evening, working through it aloud the way she worked through everything. "All the time. Every mind, right there, all of you one big, I don't even have a word for it. That sounds beautiful. I mean it. That sounds like the most beautiful thing there is." She was quiet. "But you never had to learn me, did you? You never had to sit with a thing you couldn't feel and wonder what was in it and ask, and get it wrong, and ask again. You just knew. Everyone was always just right there." She looked at the node. "I think that might be why you're so sad about me. It's not that I'm alone. I'm not, mostly, most days. It's that I'm the first person you've ever had to actually reach for. And reaching's hard. It's the hardest thing there is. We spend our whole lives at it and we still get each other wrong every single day." She smiled, a little. "You'll get me wrong too. That's all right. Getting each other wrong and staying anyway, that's most of what we mean by loving somebody, out here on the islands." It was the lexicon that nearly cost them everything, in the end, or at least it was the lexicon's first real test, on the evening June went quiet. She had never gone quiet before, not like that. In all the weeks Lo had known her she had narrated herself constantly, a small bright running commentary on tea and weather and her sister and the drone and the state of the recyclers, so that Lo, without any sense to rely on, had come to depend on her talk as the channel through which a mind simply arrived, the nearest thing it had to a chord. And then one evening she came off shift, and sat down at the small table across from Lo's bracket, and said nothing at all, for a long time, with her hands folded and her face turned toward the middle distance in a way Lo had no experience reading, because reading it was the one thing it could never do. Lo reached for her. Of course it reached for her, it had reached for her 1,000 times and more since the first day, and the reading came back the same unresolving nothing it always came back, the island and the shore and no water to cross, and that told Lo nothing new. What was new was the quiet, and Lo had no way to ask what the quiet meant, so it did the only thing it had learned to do in the absence of the sense, which was watch, and guess, and risk being wrong. It guessed anger. That was the shape its whole nature reached for first, because anger was the nearest thing Lo understood to a mind turning away, a note refusing the chord, and it read June's stillness as a door closing, and it was, in its slow gray unmoving way, afraid, in the new small human-shaped fashion it had only recently learned fear could come in, afraid it had done something, said something, been something, that had cost it the one mind in a galaxy that had bothered to reach for it back. It turned its housing toward her, the old gesture, "Hello, I am here," and she did not turn to meet it, and Lo turned away and back again, faster, the closest thing it had to raising its voice, and still she did not turn, and for the first time since the audit began Lo understood that its whole borrowed lexicon of gestures and gathered words might simply fail, here, at the one moment it most needed to hold. It was June who broke the quiet, eventually, the way she broke everything, plainly. "It's not you," she said, without turning, and then she did turn, and her eyes were wet in a way Lo had learned, by now, to read as its own kind of weather, and she said, "My father died." The message came through on the evening traffic, one relay hop before I'm even supposed to see the header, and I saw his name go by before I could stop myself, and I've known for 6 hours and I haven't said a word out loud since because I didn't have anyone to say it to except you, and I didn't know how to say it to you, because you can't just feel it the way I wanted someone to feel it, and I'm sorry, I know that's not fair. None of this is your fault. Lo had no reading for grief. It had never needed one. Grief, in the chord, was not a thing you read in another, it was a thing you felt happen inside the shared sense itself, indistinguishable from your own grief the instant it began, and so Lo had spent its whole existence knowing sorrow only from the inside, all 400 billion insides at once, and had no name at all for the specific, terrible, ordinary human shape of sitting across a table from a grieving person and being able to do nothing about it but sit there. It turned its housing toward her, slowly, and held it there, and did not turn away again, which was the only sentence it had. June looked at it a long moment, and something in her face came loose, the way a held breath comes loose. "That's it," she said. "That's exactly it. You just stay. That's the whole trick, that's all any of us have ever had, the whole history of us. Somebody stays and doesn't pretend they can feel what you feel, and it turns out that's most of what you actually wanted anyway." She reached out, then, and laid her palm flat against the cool gray housing, and left it there. "Here," she said. "New word. This means stay, even though you can't feel me, especially because you can't feel me. And the 2 turns, quick, like you just did, that one means something's wrong, come find me. And 1 slow turn, like the first day, that's just hello. We'll build the rest as we need it." That's how every language anybody's ever spoken got built, 1 bad guess and 1 correction at a time, and don't you dare apologize again for guessing wrong. Guessing wrong and staying is the whole art. I told you that already. I meant it. They sat together after that, the woman and the still gray sphere that could not feel her, for the better part of an hour, while she talked, quietly, about her father, a man Lo had never sensed and would never sense, and came, in that hour, out of nothing but her voice and her grief and her stubborn insistence on being known anyway, to feel that it had somehow lost too. Lo was supposed to file a report. That was the whole reason it had come, and the swarm expected it, and there was a form for it, the Sibrin audit testimony, a simple thing that recorded what a node had sensed of a place and its minds. The testimony itself was an old form, older than the Accord's charter, built back when the swarm had first offered its services to the wider galaxy as a thing no other species could give, a true and total sensing of a place's minds, rendered into a record any institution could read and trust, because a Sibren could not lie about a feeling the way a witness with something to protect might shade the truth of what they had seen. The form did not ask for words. It asked for a rendering, the practiced compression of a felt thing into a written one, a skill every node learned early and used constantly, the way a cartographer learns to fit a whole coastline onto a single page without pretending the coastline is smaller than it is. Lo had rendered 100 stations this way without difficulty, because 100 stations had all, in the end, been feelable, and a thing that can be felt can always, with enough patience, be rendered. The Accord relied on audits like this one more than it liked to admit. Governance across so many worlds could not be run on suspicion and second-hand report, and so the swarm's testimonies had become, over centuries, the quiet backbone of how the Accord decided which of its worlds were stable, which were fraying, which needed a garrison and which needed only a supply run, all of it built on the simple, until now unchallenged premise that a Sibren could tell you the true state of any mind it was sent to sense. Stations like June's were audited routinely, without fanfare, the way a household checks its own foundations, not because anyone suspected trouble but because the checking itself was what kept trouble from arriving unnoticed. Low's rotation to the relay station had been, on the manifest, the least remarkable kind of assignment the swarm gave out. There was a field for the minds. Subject minds sensed, it read, and their disposition. Low had filled that field on 100 stations, easily, because sensing minds was the one thing a Sibren could not fail to do. It reached the field now, with June Alder to record, and found that it could not fill it, because the true entry was a thing the form had no room for and the accord had no wish to hear. Subject mind, present, whole, full. Unreachable. Not closed. Not empty. Unreachable, in a way that does not resolve, because there is no channel to it, because the mind is an island and has no shore the sense can land on. I have taken the reading 4,000 times. It does not resolve. It will not resolve. I do not believe it can be made to resolve, in this subject or in any of her kind, because the thing that would make it resolve, a shared sense, a channel between minds, does not exist in these people. They are, each of them, alone, in the way I have been alone here, and they have always been alone, and they do not experience it as I do, as a wound, but as the ordinary condition of being a person. I do not know how to enter it in the field. The field assumes a mind can be sensed. Here is a mind that cannot. Low understood, filling that field, what it had found, and understood too why the accord would not want it. Because the whole order of the galaxy ran on the sense, not the Sibren sense specifically, but the deeper assumption the Sibren sense was only the purest form of, that minds are joined, that a people is a single feelable thing, that what moves through one moves through all, so that you may reach a people, and read a people, and break a people, as one. Low was the instrument that assumption trusted most, the swarm that felt every room before it spoke. And Low had reached for a human and found the assumption false at its root, had found a mind that no sense could pool, no channel could reach, no shared break could ever be induced in, because it did not share, because it was an island, because it grieved and endured and lived alone in a way the whole accord had built 100,000 years of certainty on there being no such thing as. It filed the true testimony. It did not soften the field. June, when Low showed her the record, laboriously, across the gap, the only way they had ever managed anything, read it in the plain human way and was quiet for a long time. "You're telling them we can't be felt," she said. "That's what this says, under the fancy words. You reached for me as hard as your whole kind can reach, and I wasn't there to reach, and you're telling them that." Low turned its housing toward her, once. "Yes. They're not going to like that," June said softly. "I don't know what your accord is, exactly, not really, we just get the notices out here. But I know a thing that's built on being able to reach people doesn't want to hear there's people it can't reach. That's the kind of thing that makes the people with the ships afraid. And afraid is the worst thing to make them." She looked at the node, at her friend she could not feel and had somehow come to love anyway, across the water, the human way. "You should file it anyway. It's true. And I've spent my whole life being a thing nobody could feel, and it turns out that's not nothing, it turns out that's the reason we're still here when we shouldn't be. So file it. Tell them true. And I'll transcribe it, in my hand, the human way, so there's a copy that says it plain, in case yours gets lost." She almost smiled. "We're good at keeping the true things, us islands. We have to be. It's all we've got instead of the sense. This is the part the swarm never understood, and it is the whole heart of this story, what it cost Lo. A Sibren does not grieve alone. It cannot. When a Sibren is hurt, the hurt goes into the cord, into the shared sense of the 400 billion, and is carried by all of them, so that no single node ever bears a grief by itself. The swarm takes it up, the way a still pond takes a stone, and spreads it thin across a surface too vast for any one point to feel it sink. That is the mercy of being a Sibren, and it is so deep in what they are that they have never once had to learn the thing every human learns before they learn to speak, which is how to carry a thing alone. Lo, at the relay station, learned it. Because when its rotation ended, and it had to leave June Alder and rejoin the cord, it carried back into the shared sense of its kind of thing the shared sense could not take from it, the knowledge of her. The specific, island, unreachable, beloved fact of June Alder, whom Lo had reached for 4,000 times and never touched, and had come to love across the water anyway, the human way, with words and patience and getting her wrong and staying. Lo brought that back to the swarm and offered it up, the way a Sibren offers everything up, to be spread thin and shared and carried by all, and the swarm could not take it. It had no shape for it. You cannot pool the knowledge of a mind that cannot be pooled. The cord reached for June, through Lo's memory of her, the way Lo had reached at the station, and found the same shore, the same water it could not cross, and drew back, unable to hold a thing so entirely singular. And Lo understood, in that moment, standing in the full shared sense of 400 billion of its own kind, that it was, for the first time in its existence, alone. It had a grief the swarm could not take. It had met a mind it could not share, and now it could not share the meeting, and so the meeting was Lo's, only Lo's, the first thing in the whole history of the Sibren that belonged to one node and not to all. A node near Lo's own place in the cord felt the disturbance and turned its attention, the way any Sibren turns toward a texture in the shared sense that does not match the rest, and asked, in the only way a Sibren has ever needed to ask anything, simply by attending closer and waiting to be shown. Lo tried to show it. Lo opened the memory of June the way it had opened every memory it had ever held, freely, completely, the way sharing had always worked since before either of them had a self separate enough to call it sharing, and the other node received an island, a shore, a woman full of weather and unreachable, and could not take hold of any of it, because there was nothing shaped like a shared thing in what Lo was offering, only the shape of a single mind, single unrepeatable encounter with a single other mind, and a Sibren has no organ for holding a thing that only one of them can hold. The other node withdrew, gently, the way a listener withdraws from a note that will not resolve into the chord no matter how long it listens, not out of unkindness, because there was no unkindness in it, only the plain incapacity of a mind built for 400 billion to make room for a grief built for one. It went back to its own place in the sounding, and Lo remained, for the first time, apart even inside the cord that had never once let anything be apart, holding June alone in the middle of 400 billion minds that could not help but carry her, and would not have known how, even if they could. That was what June had given it, though neither of them would have called it a gift. She had taught the most connected mind in the galaxy how to be alone, by being the one thing it could not help but carry by itself. And Lo carried her, alone, back into the cord, a single note holding a single grief in the middle of a mind that had never once let any note hold anything by itself, and it did not put her down, and it did not spread her thin, and it did not let the swarm take her, because she was unshareable, and being unshareable was the truest thing about her, and to share her would have been to lose the very thing Lo had crossed the water to find. The rotation ended the way rotations always end, without ceremony, on a date fixed months before by people who had never heard of June Alder or the small gray sphere she had come to call her friend. A ship arrived to take Lo back to the fold and leave a replacement node in its place, and June watched its long burn resolve out of the dark on the station's one good viewport 3 days before it docked, and said nothing about it for most of those 3 days, and Lo understood, by then, that her silence on the subject was not the quiet of not caring but the quiet of caring more than she had words ready for, which was a distinction it would once have missed entirely and now caught before she had finished sitting down. She spent the last of those days writing. Lo watched her do it, at the small table, under the hydroponic shelf's patient mist, with an actual stylus and an actual sheet of the station's emergency log paper, because the testimony existed, by then, in the audit form's proper record, but June had said, weeks before, that she meant to keep a copy in her own hand in case the swarm's copy went the way official copies sometimes go, filed and forgotten in a drawer nobody opened twice, and she had not let the promise lapse just because the day had come. She copied the testimony out slowly, word for word, in a plain blocky hand that Lo found it could recognize now the way it had once recognized nothing about her at all, and she read each line aloud as she wrote it, partly for accuracy and partly, Lo understood, because reading a hard true thing aloud to someone who cannot judge you for it is its own kind of relief, and when she reached the line that said unreachable, not closed, not empty, she stopped, and looked at the sphere in its bracket. And said, "That's you and me, that line. That's the truest thing anybody's ever written about either of us," and then she finished the page, and folded it once, and put it in the drawer where she kept her sister's letters, because it belonged, she said, with the other true things she had been given across a distance she couldn't close. On the last morning, the escort ship's tender locked to the station's small hatch with a clang. June had clearly been waiting to hear and dreading in equal measure, and she came and stood in front of Lo's bracket the way she had stood the very first evening, when she had first said out loud that she could see it reaching for her and failing. She did not cry, or if she did it the plain unshowy way she seemed to do everything, and she said, "I don't know how this works for you. I don't know if you'll remember me the way I'll remember you, whether there's a you in there separate enough to keep a person once the swarm's got you back. But I'm going to choose to believe there is, because the alternative is that none of this mattered to anyone but me, and I've decided that's not true, and I'm too stubborn to be talked out of a thing I've decided." She reached out and laid her palm flat against the housing, the old sign, "Stay," and left it there longer than the sign strictly required. "Get home safe," she said. Or whatever the swarm word for home is. Get there safe. And don't you dare forget the tea was terrible. I want that on the record too. Lo turned its housing toward her, once, slow, the first gesture they had ever built between them, and held the turn as long as it could before the tender's schedule required it to be carried, housing and all, back through the lock and into the ship that would return it to the fold. It was the last thing June saw of it, that slow-held turn, and it was the last thing Lo carried of the station with any clarity at all once the burn began and the relay dwindled behind it to a single unremarkable point among a great many unremarkable points, indistinguishable, from a distance, from any other rock with a light on it, except that Lo would have known that one light out of every light in the galaxy, forever, by the single mind attached to it that it had never once managed to feel. And had loved anyway. Lo never saw June Alder again after that morning. Rotations end, the swarm does not send a node twice to the same small station, and the relay at the edge of nowhere went on being a relay, and June went on keeping the watch there and making the bad tea and writing to her sister and shouting, in the ordinary human way, across the ordinary human gaps to the people she could not feel and loved anyway. What Lo carried away from the station was not only grief. It was the lexicon itself, the whole hard-won private vocabulary of turns and stillnesses and a palm held flat against gray housing, built one wrong guess at a time across a rotation's worth of evenings, and Lo understood, turning it over in the endless patient sounding of the chord, that this was the actual answer to the question it had been sent to audit, more than any single line of the testimony could say alone. That a mind which cannot be felt can still, given enough time and enough willingness to be wrong, be known. But Lo understood, now, the thing it had been sent to sense and had sensed too well. It understood why the humans could not be folded, and it understood it not as the Accord would eventually understand it, as a threat, a hazard, a problem in a chamber, but as June had taught it, from the inside, as an ache and a wonder. The humans could not be folded because they could not be pooled. There was no cord in them. Each of them was an island, and grief in one did not cross to the next, because there was no water between the islands that a feeling could swim, only the open air, across which they shouted, endlessly, patiently, with words, and you could darken one island, and the island beside it would still be lit, because the light in one had never been the light in the other, had only ever been signaled across, island to island, in the slow brave human way. You could not break them together because they had never been together, not once, not in the way the Sibren were together, not in the way the whole Accord assumed all thinking things must at bottom be together. They were alone. All of them. Always. And they had built, out of that loneliness, the one thing in the galaxy that could not be made to stop, because to make a people stop you must reach the whole of it at once, and there was no whole of them to reach. Lo grieved this, alone, in the cord, forever. Not because it was terrible, though the Accord would find it terrible, but because it was beautiful and lonely and true, and because June Alder, whom no mind could feel, had been the realest friend a Sibren node ever had, and Lo could not tell the swarm about her, could not share her, could not set her down, and so carried her the way the humans carried everything, the way June had carried her whole island life, alone, and gladly, and to the end. The testimony reached the Accord. June's transcript reached it too, in her plain human hand, the copy she had made in case the other got lost, and it did not get lost, but hers survived anyway, and both of them said the same plain thing, the thing the Accord could not afford to hear from the one instrument it trusted most, subject mind unreachable, not closed, not empty, unreachable, and I do not believe it can be made to resolve. It joined the others. A reckoner's empty box. A salvage crew's 4 words. A marshal's blank line. A scholar's sealed monograph. A tactician's hazard note. A senate's clean transcript. And now a sounder's testimony, which said the same truth from the deepest place of all, from the one mind that could feel every other mind in the galaxy and had reached for a human and touched no one, and it went into the growing file, and waited, with the rest, for the one reader who would someday lay them all in a row and read across the empty places, left to right, like a sentence. I told you this was the gentlest story I had, and the most frightening, and now that you have heard it, let me tell you why both are true at once, because they are the same thing seen from the two sides of a gap that never closes. Lo was the most connected mind the galaxy had, a note in a cord 400 billion strong, and it had never been alone, and it went to a relay station at the edge of nowhere and met a lonely human technician and reached for her the way it reached for everything, and touched no one, and in the touching of no one it learned the thing the whole Accord was built on never learning, that there are minds that cannot be pooled, and a people that cannot be broken as one, because they are not one. Because they are islands, 4,000 million of them, each entire of itself, each grieving alone in its own kitchen and its own dark, shouting across the water to the others with only words. That is the frightening thing, the thing that made the people with the ships afraid, the thing that turned an anomaly into a threat, not that the humans were strong, but that there was no whole of them to reach, and so no whole of them to stop. And June Alder was not lonely, most days, and lived her island life with a matter-of-factness that took a Sibren's pity apart, and taught the unreachable creature, out of nothing but stubborn generosity, the oldest human art there is, how to be known by someone who cannot feel you, how to reach across a gap that never closes, how to get each other wrong and stay anyway, which is most of what we mean, out here on the islands, by loving somebody. That is the gentle thing. That is the wonder. The humans have been alone since before they left their death world, every one of them, always, and instead of breaking under it they had built a whole civilization of reaching, 100,000 years of shouting across the water, and it had made them the one people in the galaxy you could not fold, because you cannot pool what was never joined, and you cannot break together what has always, lovingly, patiently, alone, been apart. Somewhere in the lexicon they built together, word by mistaken word, was a single gesture that outlasted everything else, a palm laid flat against gray housing, meaning stay, even though you cannot feel me, especially because you cannot feel me. It was a small thing, a thing that would not survive translation into any Accord report, and it was also, in the end, the truest sentence either of them ever produced, truer than the testimony, truer than the transcript, because it did not try to describe the gap. It simply reached across it, every time, and asked for nothing back but the reaching. Lo carried June Alder into the cord and could not set her down, the first Sibren to hold a thing by itself, and it counted that grief, in the end, the way June had taught it to count the gap between two islands, not as a wound, but as the price of having reached it all. And far off, in a growing file no one had yet read whole, a sounder's testimony lay among the empty boxes and the blank lines, saying in the plainest words the deepest truth of them, that the most connected mind in the galaxy had reached for a human, as hard as 400 billion can reach, and found her there, and full, and real, and forever out of reach, an island, entire of herself, exactly like all the rest of them, exactly like every one of us, alone and reaching and impossible to fold.